Afternoon, and thank you for attending today's webinar. My name is Jennifer Cooley, and I am the Education and Outreach Manager for the State Historical Museum. The Iowa History 101 webinars share Iowa stories and the history of the state through a cultural history lens on the second and fourth Thursdays of each month. You can learn more about this series and all of our programs on our website at iowaculture.gov. Please remember to sign up for each webinar you would like to attend, and don't worry if you can't watch live. All presentations will be recorded. Today, we will discover the history of Syrian Muslim settlement in Iowa before World War I and learn how these immigrants made a life that was simultaneously Arab, Muslim, and American. A few housekeeping points before I introduce our speaker. Everyone came into this webinar on mute with cameras off. Closed captions are available by clicking the closed caption button on your screen. The webinar is being recorded and will be placed on the Iowa Culture page of YouTube in a few days. I have disabled the chat function, but if you have any questions, please type them into the Q&A feature throughout the webinar. My colleague Matt Beyer is watching that feature and will prepare a list of questions for the speaker at the end of the presentation. But please note, we may not be able to get to all of the questions. Now I'm pleased to introduce our presenter, Edward E. Curtis. Professor Curtis is the William M. and Gail M. Plater Chair of Liberal Arts and a professor of religious studies at Indiana University, Purdue University in Indianapolis. The award-winning author or editor of 14 books about Muslim, Black, and Arab American history and life, Professor Curtis has won grants and fellowships from the National Endowment for the Humanities, the Carnegie Corporation of New York, the Fulbright Program, and the Andrew Mellon Foundation. Professor Curtis, who grew up in Mount Vernon, Illinois, is a descendant of first generation of Arab Americans who settled in the Midwest. And now I'm very happy to turn over to Professor Curtis to begin the webinar.
Thank you so much. It's my pleasure to be with you all. Thank you so much, Iowa, for inviting me to be with you this noon hour in Iowa. It's 1 o'clock where I am in Indianapolis, but I always say the only true Midwestern time is a Central Time. I am very happy to have my book be judged by its cover. Midwestern illustrator Scott Schiller designed this beautiful map for me, which then became the cover of the book, and it encapsulates the story that I want to share with you today. The story of how about 100,000 Arabic speakers came to the United States before World War I. Thousands of them settled in the Midwest. 400,000 more went to other countries in the Americas. 1 out of 5 Assyrians, which at the time would include the countries that we know today as Lebanon, Syria, Palestine, and Jordan, lived abroad at this time. So this is a mass migration of Syrians, not matched until recent times where the Civil War has seen a mass migration of Syrians from Syria. How did I get the idea to write this book? Well, it all came down to it all started with my maternal grandmother. I am Arab on my mother's side. And you see me dancing here with my granny, we called her Granny, Cassie Hamaway Moses Safa Caffrey. And she was the one who told me the stories that I needed in order to imagine this Midwest that I'm talking about, because this was the Midwest, Arabs in the Midwest before World War I and after were more than just a bunch of disconnected communities. They went long distances in order to share their culture, language, food, music with one another, to mourn each other's dead, and to welcome newly married couples. And so I knew from her stories that there was a connection in this region. The main historical figures in my book, including those from Iowa, come from the towns that you see in this map, which all happen to be located in contemporary times in the country of Lebanon. When they came, there was no country of Lebanon. This was all part of the Eastern Mediterranean ruled by the Ottoman Empire, and it was known as Syria. And so So there was that line that you see in the map didn't exist at that time, but I had Scott add it there just to indicate where roughly these both Iowans and other Midwesterners came from. These were all small villages from which they came. So why? Why the Midwest and not, why did Syrian, most of the people who came were Christian. The minority was Muslim. And today we're going to talk mainly about Muslims because it's their stories that have oftentimes been underemphasized since they have been the minority. But there were, the majority were Christian. Why did these Christians and Muslims, Arabic speakers, come to the Midwest? This 1901 map of US railroads gives you a partial answer. First of all, they could get here. They could actually get here. And second, those railroads represent great opportunity and economic growth. There's a reason why the World's Fair was held in Chicago in 1893, because Chicago was a symbol of American industrial growth, and the engine of that growth was centered in the Midwest at the time. So this is the era of industrialization, the founding of what we now sometimes call the Rust Belt along the Great Lakes. And these railroads made it possible for both people and goods to travel in ways that had never been possible before. And all of you who are from Iowa know that, because you know how many of your towns are railroad towns. Let me just say, so one of the takeaways of my book is that the lives of Ottoman Syrians show how reveal how the Midwest worked as an interconnected region in the early 1900s. It was actually about more than just those rivers, rails, and then in the 1920s, roads that connected all of us in the Midwest. It was also a human geography. I mean, how do you put together, not a physical geography, because you can't really put together the short grass prairies of the Western Dakotas, which are clearly outside the Corn Belt, with with the industrializing Great Lakes region. Those are very different ecologies, or from Southern Illinois, where I'm from, for that matter. But this was a human geography where we connected the physical through our various social, cultural, economic, and political connections. And the story of Syrian Muslims illustrate this in a fantastic way. Sometimes the smallest group can illustrate the biggest ideas. Let me start, for example, in Michigan City. So some of these immigrants left they were push and pull. They were pushed by a bad economy. There was a lack of jobs. Both Christians and Muslims left the Eastern Mediterranean in this era of industrialization, when their traditional jobs are disappearing and more lands are being held by big landholders. So they don't have access to enough land to farm either. And so they come, and then the pull is in the Midwest, I already mentioned, was the economic opportunity. Some of that economic opportunity were jobs in places like Michigan City, where hundreds of Muslims and Christians worked for John Barker, who was the largest employer at the time in the state of Indiana, making railroad cars, including this caboose that you see on your screen. This is Haskell and Barker Railroad in Michigan City, Indiana. As I was trying to reconstruct their lives, one of the difficulties was, this is a page from the city directory at Michigan City, was to tell one person from another. Look at how many people are named Ali here. And 4 of them are J. Ali. So I had to use multiple sources in order to figure out who was who sometimes, especially before World War I. It became a little easier after World War I, but before World War I, it was sometimes very confusing to figure out, they're living near each other, they come from the same villages. That was one of the challenges of the book. Let me keep going with this question. Why again did they settle in the Middle East, or in the Midwest, come from the Middle East to the Midwest? And one of the main characters in my book is one of the little children you see in this picture. I can't tell you which one she is. Aliyah Ogdi Hassan from Sioux Falls, South Dakota. And these are her parents, Ali and Fatima. And they, I trace Aliyah Hassan's story from her birth in South Dakota all the way to her sort of coming of age in Detroit. And her life really illustrates a lot of the themes of the Syrian Muslim Midwest. Her dad, Ali, he got his start as a peddler, like so many of our people. I am the great grandson of peddlers. So many Syrian and Lebanese people were peddlers, including in Iowa, but across the United States. And so, so if you look at the left side of your screen, the very left, and you look at the wood-framed yellow colored building closest to the Great Sioux River in Sioux Falls, that's where, when he became a peddler, Ali Ogdi lived and worked. And you can see outside of, and I use these Sanborn insurance maps to figure out all the nitty-gritty details about the characters in my book, their lives, what they had available. So he steps out. He has most of what he needs on North Phillips Avenue in Sioux Falls. And I don't know if I would have wanted to live near that close to the river during the spring, but that's what was available. And you can see this is a census page on the right. It was helpful to know some Arabic because the names aren't always, they don't always, in this case, he's Ogda Alec, and his name in Arabic is Okdi, but I figured out Okdi is Ogda. He's the same person. So why the Midwest? Why did he go to South Dakota? The answer, free land. So this is another reason for, one of the other reasons why this region became the economic powerhouse of the country was related to agriculture. In 1868, the United States government signs a treaty with at Fort Laramie, guaranteeing the western half, which you see on this map on the left, of both of the Dakotas will be perpetually set aside as the Great Sioux Reservation, and other native peoples also had land set aside for them. But Congress changes its mind in the late 1880s. They take that land away from native peoples, violate their own treaties, and they put that in the homesteading, and anyone can get 160 acres for free, or or for a very small filing fee. And so news of this spread really all across networks, including Arabic-speaking networks. And so whereas at home, Ali Ogdi couldn't get much land, but in the Western Dakotas, there was free land to be had. And he settled, if you look at the right part of the map, outside of Kadoka, South Dakota, which is the gateway to the Badlands. Now, any of you who have been there, this is not Iowa farmland. Or having married into a northern Iowa family, it would be more akin to what my northern Iowa family often calls southern Iowa farmland, which they told me was, I don't know, somehow inferior. I don't know. But this is much worse. These are short grass prairies, and this is, and they're trying to do intensive agriculture here, and so it's very hard to farm. But in order to get that land, you have to build a house, which oftentimes is just a tar paper shack, which you also see depicted. Not much to shield you from the winds in the winter and minus 20-degree temperatures. And you have to put the land, you have to show that you're making effort to bust the sod, till the land, and plant crops. You don't have to have it all planted, but you have to be making an effort towards that. Then you prove up and you get your land patent or your deed, which is exactly what Ali Ogdi did. But as he's doing this, his wife Fatima joins him. She has 2 very young children and a dog. She's putting out the wash, and this is how chapter 1 of my book begins. It begins with the line, "The rattlesnake was the final straw." Because as she's putting the wash out, the rattlesnake approaches, kills the dog, and almost gets the children, but Fatima kills the snake. She issues Ali ultimatum. Look, either we're moving to Sioux Falls or I'm going back to Syria. So Ali obliges, and they move to Sioux Falls. An inevitable question about this population is, do Syrian Muslims face discrimination? The answer is absolutely. There's never a time that I'm talking about when social discrimination goes away. These kids, even the 40s, the 50s, it goes on. Even after World War II, people, especially those of us who are darker skinned, that's a very important piece of this, face discrimination in the Midwest. So social discrimination, yes. Legal, it depends. So first of all, Ali Ogdi and all those other Syrian Muslims and Christians who homesteaded, they were counted as white people by the Dakotas for the purpose of homesteading. So even if they weren't, their fellow citizens didn't see them as white, the government at that time was. It really does depend on locality. In 1908, the federal government then changed its mind. The Secretary of Commerce and Labor started sending marshals to all the courts across the Midwest, telling judges, don't naturalize these Syrians because they're not white. At that time, if you're Asian, it's illegal to become a naturalized citizen of the United States. And so, but in Cedar Rapids, as you can see from my slide here, a number of authorities, including pretty high-ranking authorities, stand up to the federal government, says, now, wait a minute, this is totally improper. And they really challenge that federal authority. So it very much depends. So in Cedar Rapids, before World War I, Syrians are often seen as another white ethnic group. City officials defend their whiteness and citizenship eligibility against federal prosecution. They do not do so, they do not defend African Americans and Native peoples. But remember, these Syrian Muslims are being seen as white people, a little different, but still white. In my book, the reason why I argue this is so is because Cedar Rapids, unlike Sioux Falls, is a multi-ethnic town that depends on a multi-ethnic population, and the Bohemians, that is, of the Czech and the Slovak population, have all paved the way for a different language being spoken, for buildings with that language. You could the Sokolovna Gymnasium, for those of you who know Cedar Rapids, you know the clubs are big, the Bohemian churches are powerful. So they've paved the way, and in a lot of ways, and they're so the Syrians are small in number, but the Bohemians are big enough to make a difference. And oftentimes Bohemians and Syrians become friends and are defending each other's interests. Now, this was very different than Michigan City, Indiana, which I already showed you. Before World War I, Syrians are people of color, not white people. They're subject to police violence, as well as social and legal discrimination. Even though it's the North, yes, there's still plenty of legal discrimination. This is partly because of the nature of their economic roles in Michigan City. Overwhelmingly, the biggest employer in town, Haskell Barker, is employing them. And the reason why John Barker hires them in part is because he thinks they're such bad English speakers that they won't be able to talk to the other workers of other ethnic groups in order to form unions. And this is what he wanted to prevent, unionization. So I mean, it's hard to imagine, because in Arab American memory, we always associate Detroit with Arab America. But at this time, Barker employs more Arabs than Henry Ford does. Now, like a lot of other people of color, one of the only ways you could occupy public space at this time is by performing for white people, including in sports. And so Michigan City develops a whole culture of wrestling. And this man, who's known as the Terrible Turk, Turk is the word they used in Michigan City for Syrian Muslim, he actually has a fan club in Michigan City. This is Yusuf Hussein, and he's from Michigan. But he comes into town, and when he fills up the auditorium when he comes into town, and there's a whole gymnasium devoted to Syrian Muslim men teaching Syrian Muslim boys how to wrestle. Now, the main difference is that in Iowa, they actually have cheerleaders for wrestling, at least in high school. I don't think they have, we don't have cheerleaders, unfortunately, in Indiana, which is a shame in my view. My sister-in-law was one of those in Garner. So these Yusuf Hussein is a big figure in town, but he doesn't have. I mean, he's a performer. It's okay as long as he can't actually go to the beach because Assyrians aren't permitted on the beach at this time, and Lake Michigan. But World War I is a turning point in the lives of Syrian Muslims in the Midwest. Why? Well, in Michigan City, Uncle Sam does not have enough volunteers because most Americans are deeply opposed to U.S. involvement in World War I. So a draft of conscription begins. And the first conscript in Michigan City happens to be a Syrian Muslim. Muhammad Daboja or Dabeja you can see him with holding the flag, signing his conscription papers. And for many Syrian Muslims and Christians, they actually had a twofer. First of all, they get citizenship if they serve in naturalized citizenship if they serve in the military, and two, they get to help free their homelands from Ottoman Turkish occupation, because most of these Syrian Muslims and Christians want freedom for Arabic-speaking peoples in the Eastern Mediterranean. They want self-determination. They're in favor of Wilsonianism, the idea that a people gets to determine their own form of government. And so they sign up. This makes all the difference in the world. In Michigan City, one of the main kind of informal correspondents in Europe is a guy named Joseph Ali. Here's one of those J. Alis. And he sends reports back to the Michigan City newspaper all the time. And he also, though, even though, like so many Black people, even though he serves honorably in the U.S. Armed Forces, the American Expeditionary Force, he still faces discrimination at the beach. So he actually sues when he's not given a bathing suit at the bathing house. Remember, bathing suits back then were far more complicated and expensive things. So you don't just, so you actually could rent one. Okay, so he sues, and a jury of his white peers say, you know what, that's right. And this case integrates the beach for Syrians, but not for Black people. Not until after World War II does it become integrated for Black people in Michigan City. Now, also after World War I and before World War II, Muslim religious congregations, like other Midwest congregations, built cultural, social, and political power for these Syrian Muslims. And so depending, as long as they have the critical mass to do it, like in Cedar Rapids. And so this is a little bit, this idea is counterintuitive to sort of common sense, in that people think sometimes when you hold on to your religion and your ethnic heritage, that you're resisting assimilation. Not in the Midwest. That's not how we structured our society. In the Midwest, in order to participate in society, you had to have your ethnic religious congregation. Think about how Cedar Rapids and other towns work. Your philanthropy, your service, so even your politics often came out of your networks at your church, synagogue, or later mosque. And so whether we're talking about the Ashkenazi synagogue, or the Scandinavian holiness Christians, or the Bohemian church, whatever it is, that was a pathway to assimilation, to participation in American society. It doesn't mean giving up certain aspects. It means integrating those aspects into the public culture of Iowa and other states. So that's exactly what Syrian Muslims did. Now, contrary to some misunderstandings, Iowa was not the first place to build a mosque. There were mosques, they weren't built, they were just rented already in the 1890s in New York. But by in the Midwest really joins in 1921 when in Highland Park, Michigan, the first mosque in the country is built by Muslims for Muslims. Built by Muslims for Muslims. So this is the Highland Park Mosque. Then in 1929, Ross, North Dakota erected its mosque. Yes, it does look more like a outbuilding than a mosque. This is what they could afford. It's probably cost them about $600. They put it up themselves in 1929. Then in 1931, this was not built. They bought it and then they renovated it in Michigan City. This was the Michigan City Mosque in 1931, just about 3 blocks from Lake Michigan. And then finally in 1934, Cedar Rapids built what affectionately became known as the Mother Mosque. Here you can see on the picture, it's called Muslim Temple, or in Arabic, Al-Nadi al-Islami, meaning the Islamic Club. And this one costs more. They really worked, men and women worked very, very hard to raise the money for this mosque. And if you go to Cedar Rapids today, you can go to the History Center there and see much more about the Syrian Lebanese people. There's an exhibit, beautiful exhibit going on right now, maybe very close to some of you, but worth a visit there. Now in Cedar Rapids, and really across the Midwest, it was the neighborhood Syrian grocery, which became an institutional pillar of community. This is what enabled Muslims to have the money during the Great Depression to build and maintain these mosques. The grocery was a de facto financial institution, one of the few places you could get credit in the Depression, because you'd go to your neighborhood grocery. Sometimes it would be a person of your same ethnic group, and they would give you food on credit, and they would carry you on their books for a long time. But when you did get that job, where would you bring that paycheck or that pay? You bring it to pay your bill at the grocery. So by extending credit, when oftentimes banks were not in a position to do that, uncollateralized loans, right? These groceries really became economic pillars of the community. And they were, in the end, those groceries were oftentimes the source of the wealth that was needed even during the Depression. Not just to build mosques, but to have fun at social gatherings. And oftentimes they had social gatherings around the mosque. In this case, this is the Michigan City. They would go long distances to see each other. This is EPA built lodge at Kruger Park in Michigan City. And here we have the first 2, maybe 3 generations of Syrian and Lebanese Muslims from Michigan City and Detroit, but really we don't know, they could be from long distances. And you'll see the generational styles reflected. Some women are wearing hijabs or headscarves. Other women are wearing flapper hats. If you look closely, you'll see flapper hats next to some of the men, have on your more traditional business type hats, and then others have their newspaper boy or Great Gatsby hats. And they would have these maharajans or festivals, reciting poetry, singing music, eating grape leaves and tabbouleh and mutton, and enjoying each other. And this is labeled in their ihtifal, at their ihtifal, their gathering of Jamiat al-Asr al-Jadid al-Islami, at the new generation or the new era Islamic society in Michigan City. And the same thing happened. They would picnic, go back a little. They would picnic outside the mosque in Cedar Rapids as well, and spend the whole day there basically sometimes. So the second generation was fully American, fully assimilated, and fully Muslim in many cases. Now, did everyone always keep up their faith? No, because Americans don't always keep their faith traditions. That's just not, but many did. And a great example of that was Abe Hamed from Fayette, Iowa, north of Cedar Rapids. So Abe and his sisters, they were all in 4-H. This is, his award-winning Holstein. I mean, my mother-in-law told me when she saw this picture, every single boy she's ever met in Iowa has a similar picture. And she's from rural Iowa, I should say. So, but then on the left, this is the 150-year-old Quran that Abe's family brought with them to the United States and that he learned from. So you can do both. It's not, they're not contradictions in terms to be fully American and fully Muslim. You may have noticed though, sometimes being extremely pietistic, like making sure to keep all the prayers or not drinking, those were less important than learning the basics of Islamic religion, building a mosque and maintaining that mosque, keeping up your identity and your culture. Those were oftentimes more important to these Muslims than strictly observing all of the behaviorals, should do's, best to do, these kinds of things. Cedar Rapids was, in my book, represented what was, what was the most sort of integrated in many ways community that I met. In that, when I say integrated, I don't mean that they left behind their Arab and Muslim culture. It's the opposite. Arab and Muslim culture became publicly recognized in Cedar Rapids. And to me, there's no better evidence of that than in 1937. The Iowa Secretary of State headlines the anniversary of the mosque. Now, in modern times, we sometimes have trouble getting politicians to just visit mosques, much less actually give a speech there. And here we have, the Iowa Secretary of State, and it's in the newspaper, it's in the Gazette. This is a very public recognition of Islam and of the Muslims who practiced Islam in Cedar Rapids. So what happened to these communities? The fate of these communities largely depended on historical forces like agricultural economics and industrial growth, not any lack of individual effort or desire of the communities to sustain their congregations. So what do I mean by that? This amazing community out in North Dakota, look at, these are all Syrian Muslim farmers here on the left. Look at those, all those adult men, including taking care of their kids there. And those are all Syrian Muslims from Ross, North Dakota. They built that mosque, but they just couldn't sustain, that agriculture, in a place where, first of all, I mean, they had been going through an agricultural depression. The agricultural depression started in the 1920s after World War I, when the price of wheat absolutely dropped to the bottom. And, and North Dakota had the fewest government contracts of any state during World War II. It did not industrialize. So there weren't jobs off the farm to keep the farms, which often happened, I know, in farm families where you work off the farm so you can keep the farm. They didn't have that. And the land was just not, it was more for grazing than for intensive agriculture. It just wasn't sustainable. So they had to go find work elsewhere. But their legacy is incredible, including the legacy of people like Mary Juma, who was a homesteader and a peddler, the woman you see on the right of the picture with her kids and her grandkids. And she got to Western North Dakota around 1902 with her husband. And I tell her story as well in the book. So these people move, they start moving in the 1920s. They move and really by World War II, they go from the Dakotas, but also they go from Michigan City and from Sioux Falls. And they people like Sergeant Ali Joseph Said, and then the woman whom she's all grown up in this picture, Aliyah Ogdi Hassan, who moves to Detroit when she goes to school in Sioux Falls, really learns, gets a great education in the public school of Sioux Falls, and then goes to and then by the age of 15, she moves to Detroit. When she gets married, and starts her life there. And she will, in my book, we follow her, the kinds of losses goes through. She had a very hard life, but incredibly, by the 1960s, she emerges as one of the most important Arab American Muslim women leaders in the country, and expressing all of that knowledge that she gained in growing up in the Midwest, and also all of the heritage that her parents taught her and her community taught her. but these people eventually, so many of them move from other places, not all of them, but so many do. I mean, the community stays put in Cedar Rapids to Metro Detroit, that's where it becomes the capital of the Arab Muslim Midwest. Economic opportunity, like the building of the River Rouge plant, which at one time is the largest single plant. And I tell the story of Mike Ossie, who a former Quaker Oats employee, who goes to work in Dearborn for a while and then comes back to Cedar Rapids, and we meet a lot of the Ossie family in my book. So that's what creates the Detroit that we know. It becomes the kind of, the center of a Syrian Muslim Midwest that is thoroughly in its origins dispersed across the upper Midwest. All right, so I tried to, yes, I went rather quickly through the slides so that I would have plenty of time for questions. And I am now ready to take those questions.
Well, thank you, Professor Curtis. We do have time to answer some questions. If you have a question, though, please submit it through our Q&A feature here on Zoom. And let's get started. Our first question comes in. Can you offer more background or examples of support between the Czech Bohemian Iowans and the Syrian Iowans in Cedar Rapids?
Yes. So I detail this more in my book. I'm not going to be able to come up with all the names and dates, unfortunately, from memory. But what we have some members of the community establish business relationships with Czech and Slovak people. And those business relationships, especially in the grocery business, are important. Some of them are just customer kind of relationships, but the corner grocery is your neighborhood grocery back then. So those were very important. We have at least one member going to study Czech at evening classes so that she can speak with her Czech customers or with her Bohemian customers. The ZBJ Hall, and I probably got that wrong, but one of the Bohemian halls rents its space before they have a mosque. One of the ways that Syrian Muslims raise money to have their mosque, to build their mosque, is to hold what they call Oriental dances. This would include, and they serve Arab food or Levantine food like grape leaves and this kind of thing, and they hire a band, and it's later at night, and they have a fun time, and they charge a entrance fee. And that's one of the ways that women in particular, women really lead the fundraising for the mosque. And so the Bohemians provide the space for that to happen. So those are three examples of the kind of cooperation that I'm talking about.
Thank you. Our next question, did Syrians or Muslims in Iowa have a different experience than others in Midwest states with larger Muslim populations?
So is it the claim that there were larger Muslim populations in other states? Let me get the question right before I answer.
Correct. Yeah. So the question kind of breaks down to, did Syrians or Muslims in Iowa have a different experience than others in Midwest states with larger Muslim populations?
Okay, so it's important to say that at this point, I mean, one of the things I was trying to show with those slides is that we now think of Chicago and Detroit as being the big Arab American Muslim towns, and in particular Detroit. And even though Detroit definitely had a larger population of Arab Muslims, these Muslims were dispersed. If you look at the map, you see how you can draw a line from the upper Midwest to all of these cities. I mean, they were literally in some cases they land in Chicago and then they take the Rock Island line to Cedar Rapids, right? And so before World War I, there is a lot of disbursement. So one of the reasons why we probably don't have more mosques is because we have smaller communities overall. And why is that? Think again about the two main occupations of people in the western part of the Midwest. Peddler. Okay, you can't carry the same territory. You've got to meet. So everybody would divide up the territory. And once a guy really worked, and sometimes women, they would work a territory, that became known as their territory. And they would figure out, for example, what a farm wife would want. And then they would have a regular ongoing sales relationship with that farm wife, and they would bring her what she wanted. So that was, that was whoever, that was one of the Aussie clans, would have had certain clients. So you want to be dispersed for that. You don't want to all go into the same place, right? Okay, that's two, you want to become farmers, right? Now, Muslims did become farmers in Iowa, people like the Hamids. Oftentimes they were sharecroppers or tenant farmers or farm hands at first, because all of the land was already sold and it was already expensive for people who didn't have a lot of money. So if you wanted to claim land, once again, in order to be a homesteader, you've got to go way out west. You can't claim the same 160 acres. So you got to disperse yourself across the Dakotas. This is why the overall numbers in the Dakotas of Syrians is large, but they are throughout the two states. And again, the Syrians are larger than the Christians are larger than the Muslims. I mean, we've had at least 2 Syrian senators from the Dakotas, Jim Abnor and James Abu Rezek, for example. So we have before we have it dispersed. After World War I, when we begin to see a much more concentrated Arab population in Detroit, the result is the sustaining of cultural and religious diversity that people who are in smaller towns with smaller populations cannot afford. For example, in Detroit, we have Shia and Sunni mosques. In Cedar Rapids, we don't. Sunnis and Shias go to the same mosque. Why? Because you don't have enough people to have separate mosques at that time. And you're all Arabic speakers and you're from the same villages. Oftentimes, Sunni and Shia from exactly the same village. You have so much more in common than not. And so in an environment in which it's really important to you to keep your Arabic heritage alive, to be able to talk with people especially if you're first gen, to talk to people, share your emotions in the language with which you grew up. Enjoy that music together, enjoy the dancing together. We have intersectary, and we have a similar thing that happens even though St. George, the Orthodox Christians form their own church in Cedar Rapids. The Orthodox Christians and the Muslims in Cedar Rapids still have friendships and still do business and still help one another. The women of the church roll grape leaves for the mosque and vice versa when they're having a fundraiser. And they cooperate on political issues too. So once you get to larger populations in Dearborn and Detroit, then you can have more specialized mosques. Just like, if you think about Christianity, we have so many different denominations, and each of those denominations oftentimes splits into new denominations. That same process occurs over time among the Muslim congregations in Detroit, but that's because you have enough people to actually support them. I hope that's a long answer, but I hope it's a clear one.
Thank you. That was great. And actually, ties into our next question about mosques. As you mentioned, the Mother Mosque in Cedar Rapids is considered one of the first purpose-built and surviving mosques in North America. But what were the reasons why Cedar Rapids was the place selected?
Yes. So first of all, it was selected. Okay, it wasn't selected by foreigners. It was people who had moved to Cedar Rapids who wanted to have a mosque. And the reason why they wanted to have a mosque was they wanted to be American. Because think about if you're living in Cedar Rapids in 1915, almost everybody has a religious congregation. So that's just part of your identity, whether you're Jewish or Christian. Almost everybody belongs to a religious congregation. So part of the Americanization of Islam is the emergence of the mosque as a preeminent religious institution. Why Cedar Rapids? Because Cedar Rapids was a boom town. It was a boom town with all kinds of opportunity people to sell to, jobs to work at American Oats or what would become Quaker Oats, manufacturing jobs, peddling jobs. They came to Cedar Rapids for the same reason they came to Sioux Falls and that they went out to the Dakotas, and these were all opportunities to make it, to get to earn money either through peddling or through employment. So and they could get there. It was possible to get to Cedar Rapids because it was a river and a railroad town. So a part of this is random. It's random. But what happens is one person goes, they make a success of it, then they send word, or word gets out through their networks, and then then chain migration occurs. This is and they can be more successful when they settle as at least have a critical mass of a group in one place. So in Sioux Falls and Cedar Rapids and Chicago, Michigan City, in Cairo, Illinois, which is also on your map, these Syrian Lebanese, they settle together and they help one another.
And actually, talking about communities, a question from Mary Jo. Have you done research on the Syrian community once located in Mankato, Minnesota? She references that it was included in a children's book series by Maud Hart Lovelace. Yeah,
the Betsy Tacy. Yeah, I'm very familiar with that. I have done research on Minnesota. There may have been a few Muslims there, but the historical records at this point and I was fairly thorough, do not sustain the idea that there was a Muslim community critical mass. And so that's why Minnesota. But there were a lot of Arabs in Minnesota. Most of them were Christian. They established churches, and they had a very vibrant Arab American culture there.
Another question about your book, actually, from Joanne. Do you have any information in your book regarding the Rashid families and Nafi families in Fort Madison and Burlington, Iowa?
No, I do not include. One of the things I say in the introduction to the book is this is not a comprehensive history. What I did was I chose the families that I chose because I knew so much about them. Using oral histories and multiple sources, I can tell you what they ate, what it smelled like outside where they lived. I can tell you about their divorces, about their losses, about their loves, their celebrations. I mean, I really wanted as much as possible to bring to life about 20 figures in this book. And so you get a very concrete sense of these people as people. Because one of my concerns was if I just kind of cover them superficially, is that it would perpetuate this idea again of their kind of foreignness. And I wanted to make sure that people understood, yes, they were fully Arab, but they were so Midwestern. And so in order to do that, I chose to focus only on certain families, and the Rashid family was not one of them.
This is a multi-part question, so I'll kind of dig into a little bit with you. To begin with, there's a character in Rodgers and Hammerstein's Oklahoma who represents a Syrian peddler. So a question about peddlers. Can you give a little more background information on peddlers? Were they usually Muslim or Christian, single or married, and what could they have sold?
Yes, that's a great question. So my grandfather grew up in Drumright, Oklahoma, and he was recruited out of Drumright High School to play by Newt Rockne, and played and got a football scholarship at Notre Dame University, where he met my grandmother, that you saw the picture of before it, who was going to St. Mary's College at that time in South Bend. And so in fact, Bill Safa's brother was also recruited by Rockne. So I know that community pretty well. I spent quite a lot of time there. They are like Minnesota, they are overwhelmingly Christian. There's not a sustained Muslim. Again, sometimes we have Muslims, but if you don't have other Muslims with which to marry or to practice your religion with, it'll oftentimes go away. This is a natural part of immigration. I see this as just part of human life. So they would be, these peddlers were Christians and were Muslims. Again, I come from peddlers from Cairo, not in Egypt, in Illinois. And so they would sell, once they developed a clientele, they would ask their clients what they wanted. So if the farm wife in Iowa, for example, needs dry goods, canned goods, they'll get canned goods. If they need cloth, certain kinds of cloth, they'll get cloth. In the cities, these peddlers sometimes portray themselves as the exotic visitors from the Holy Land of Jerusalem, even though they're actually from north of there, and will sell trinkets, crosses, and holy water and silks and other things from the Holy Land. So whatever, they're accused of, oftentimes in the newspapers, they're accused of selling, cheap items, and some of them are cheap items, but, it really did depend. In Cedar Rapids, for example, these peddlers became, they had motorized vehicles, and they were, they could bring you furniture if you needed. So they developed a good business as traveling salesmen, and that's really what we need to think of them as traveling salesmen.
Our last two questions will focus on research. So in your research, what archives were the most beneficial to you?
Yes, so the place where I got the most oral histories, and those oral histories, again, really allowed me to capture people's lives, where they're talking about their parents, was the Elixa Knaff collection at the National Museum of American History and the Smithsonian. And many of these date from the 1970s and the 1980s. So you're still talking about the children then, the second generation in many cases. So that was the single greatest. Then the Arab American National Museum was the second biggest archive that I used for all pictures, all kinds of ephemera, in addition to documents. And then after that, the Bentley Historical Library at the University of Michigan was extremely useful. And in my acknowledgments, I talk about all of the librarians, including those in Cedar Rapids, who helped me put together this story. Local historians across and archivists across the region were so helpful to me. And if it hadn't been sometimes for these local historians recording the interviews of people, I would not have been able to write the book. So that's where, and then I used all kinds of digitized resources as well. Being able to do keyword searches in digitized newspapers was absolutely essential to making some of the new discoveries I did about Cedar Rapids and other places, because I had thousands of documents at my newspaper articles, city directories, census data that I could get through, a more focused digital search.
And this will be our last question. Talking about your research, what was a surprising or exciting discovery you found? Is there a favorite person you discovered in your research? Anything that jumped out to you?
Well, let me say that maybe the single best part of this experience was when I brought this book to Cedar Rapids, and the children, the grandchildren, and the great-grandchildren of the characters in my book were sitting in front of me at the History Center. And then, not only was that an incredible experience, I spent the whole next day with them, visiting the places that mattered to their lives, meeting the widow of one of the main characters, 92-year-old widow of one of the main characters in my book. It was just a deeply meaningful experience. So I have to say that was a highlight of that. And I will say too that there was something, being Arab American, about finding out how old some of our traditions, how long some of our traditions have been rooted in this region. When I saw the I think it was a pre-World War I newspaper article, from the Dakotas, about a Syrian farmer planting this new crop that could grow in dry soil. And they were very concerned about that. They called it dry farming because of the lack of moisture in the western part of the Dakotas. And it could be very used. It was called the Syrian pea. And in their language, they call it HAMUS. And I knew him in hummus, chickpeas. So we've been making hummus chickpea dip, for more than 100 years now in the Midwest. And that kind of rootedness, I don't know why exactly but I absolutely loved this surprise. There was something really beautiful about it for me.
That's amazing. It's a great way to end today as well. With that answer, we will bring our webinar to a close. I think we can all agree this has been a very informative lunch today. And thank you to everyone joining us. as well. And we would like to extend one last thank you to our presenter, Professor Curtis. Thank you for being here with us today. We hope everyone will sign up for the Iowa History 101 webinars that take place on the 2nd and 4th Thursdays throughout the year. There are many great stories from Iowa's past to tell in the upcoming months. Now, for more information and to register for future webinars in this series, check out our website at iowaculture.gov. This webinar and past presentations are available on our website as well. And while you're there, you can look into some other fantastic programs we have, such as our Goldie's Kids Club activities for young historians, or watch video recordings of the Iowa Stories series, which is hosted by our Iowa City branch. We look forward to virtually seeing you all here again on Thursday, April 28th. Thank you all again for joining us today, and have a great afternoon. Thank you, everyone.